Hey everybody, how's it going? Corey Wakefield here with another V2 element video for you guys, and we're going to be running through the text-based elements today. We've got a little bit of an update to how those work since our last video, because with this latest release where we brought advanced controls over from Pro's header and footer builders into the content builder, we also introduced a whole new slew of features into both of these elements and the text partial that powers both of them. So we want to take a moment to kind of run through those with you guys, make sure you are aware of these new features so that you can keep them in mind when you're working on your new designs, and just kind of get your wheels turning with a few examples of how you might utilize them in your own projects. So starting with the headline element, the biggest things to keep in mind that are different this time around are we have included the typing option that actually used to be an element in classic elements. It was called text type. Which gave a cool kind of animated typing effect where a part of your sentence could be animated and have this typing look to it. And it's great for big like call to action headlines that you might use on a page with a call to action button right below. So now instead of that being a separate element, it is its own feature within the headline element. So simply clicking this will turn that on and you can see it there. I also couldn't think of a third word that matched the length of these other two, so that's why we got kiwis in there for number 3. But you can see the basic format is the same as the old text type element. So you will have essentially, the prefix to your sentence, which is kind of the beginning. You'll have your middle bits of text, which typically works best as one word that you want to have typed out, and then you'll have the suffix that ends everything out. A good little rule of thumb to keep in mind is usually with the prefix you'll want to add a little space here at the end, and with the suffix you'll add a space here at the beginning, and that's what will keep these words spaced out here properly. Now when you turn text typing on, not only can you change the content, but you've got this little setup box where you can set up a few timing things. So effectively the speed of how the text types forward and backwards. So here I've got them at the exact same rate. If I were to change this to 1 second, you'll notice that it'll type forward pretty fast and then back up very slowly, one letter at a time. So you can adjust those independently. And then you've got your delay. So this is an initial delay. So when somebody first hits your page, imagine that they're seeing this big call to action headline. You might not want that first word to cycle right away because maybe you want them to you want to make sure they see that. So you could set up an initial delay for when that works, and then you can also set up a back delay for when a word reaches the end before it goes back to the next word. So a few little timing things just to get that all just right. You can loop the typing. So for example, when this gets to kiwis, it'll loop back to style whenever it's done. If you want it to end on that final word, just turn off loop typing and it will stop at kiwis or whatever your third word is or fourth word. And just end there. So that's good if you just want it as a quick kind of attention getter, but then to stop and not take too much attention up from there on out. We also have this cursor option, which you can turn on or off. Turning the cursor off, you just get the words typing in. I find the cursor just kind of helps, hit the effect home and help you really understand a little bit what's going on there. And then you can adjust the color for both the text and the cursor. And typically something I like to do is make the color of both of these stand out just a little bit from your headline. So not only do you get the animation, but the color helps differentiate it from the rest of the text and know, okay, something's going on here. You can of course blend it in or just change the color of the text or just change the color of the cursor. Those are all great little design techniques that add a lot. But typically I like to set those apart. So that is the first big change, is that classic element text type has kind of been folded into the headline element as a feature. Because really it's not that different. The text type element was essentially single line text, which is basically what the headline is for. And so it's sort of an augmentation of the single line text rather than needing to be its own element. So we'll turn that off. The next big update is how the text within the headline works. So now, kind of similar to anchors, where you have kind of your primary and secondary text, Headlines can set up their primary text, which is just called the text, and then you can also set up a subheadline. So if we turn that off, you'll see right here we get our primary text with our graphic, which we'll talk about in a second. But we can enable that subheadline, and much like the secondary and primary text for anchors, we can reverse that order. We can change the spacing of how that works out. And then you have complete stylistic control over each line of text. So something to keep in mind with the headline is similar to the anchor. Each of these text options is applied directly to that line of text itself. So for example, when I adjust the font size here for the text, I'm literally adjusting just this one line of text, not the base font size. And those layers are kind of important. You want that base font size here, for example, because you might want to set the base font size of the container to be 1em, so that if you want to use ems for spacing, that can be consistent. But then you can adjust each line independently. And it also kind of determines, or it's dependent on the fact that when you're adjusting things like line height, if those were inherited from the parent and then overwritten on a child, it can create some kind of funky issues with formatting. So the CSS, the generated CSS, is slightly different for how that works, but you shouldn't see any functional difference on the front end, as whenever you guys update the theme, any of that generated CSS is kind of flushed and rehashed to update to the latest system. Do keep in mind that each line is independent, so much like the anchor, if you wanted to center something, notice that when I click center text here, I just see a little bit of movement because I've got a max width on my headline. So this line is actually going right to about here, so it's got a little bit of space to occupy, but my text here is not centered. So you've also got to adjust your subheadline if that was a look you were going for, because remember, each one is completely independent. And then the final addition to the headlines is the inclusion of our new graphic partial, which we talk about in another video. This used to be part of just the anchors, so buttons, toggles, menu items, but we've added it to the headline because really it's opened up a lot of stylistic options, ways to create some really engaging, lists of features, and it's actually effectively taken the place of what was the classic feature box. With the classic feature box, you effectively had a little graphic, and then you had kind of a main headline of text and then some subtext. And you can use all of the features now in the headline to recreate the look of that old feature box shortcode and then do a whole lot more with it. And I'll show you a little bit of that here in a second. So if you haven't seen the graphic partial video, definitely go check that out. I go into that in a lot more detail and how you can use it. So we're not going to run into all that here. But just for this example, you'll see that I do have a graphic set up. And I'm going to run through a little bit of what you might use some of those options for right now. So for example, let's say I jump back here and I adjust my max width a little bit. So we've got a little bit of a wrap on that headline. I can now use this text content flex layout, which is very similar to the anchor content flex layout, where if I have a graphic turned on, now I can really utilize all the power of this. So for example, I can align the contents of my headline vertically at the start. So you notice the icon jump to the top there. We might do it to the end. It'll be at the bottom. Keep that centered. If I swap this to a reverse layout, got the icon at the end. And again, we can do the same. Oops, wrong one. We can do the same adjustments vertically. Move it back to the center. If I put this off and then go to a column layout, again, we can adjust things horizontally or bring this to the start. So you can see there's lots and lots and lots of layout options that you can play around with to do some really great looks. If we move this back to a row, and if we were to say duplicate this, you can see how we could quickly get like a really cool little list going, especially if there was, I have a background on here just so you can see the container and see that icon kind of moving around. But you could very quickly create some really engaging lists, with a little centered icon to the side. So it's great for all sorts of stuff, not just pure headlines, because remember that the headline element itself can be wrapped in anything. It can be a paragraph if you need it to be. Any one of the headlines, a div, a span. It's really up to you what you want that markup to look like, but you now have all these features, and since it's typically used for a headline, that's what the element's called, but it really can be used for lots of different scenarios. Another styling example of how you might use that, again, is to take your headline element, and I've just wrapped it in a div here, and then we've got a graphic turned on, and we're using an image this time. So I've uploaded my image. It's got the retina setting turned on, so it's not all blown out and fuzzy. And then if I go back to my text, you'll see that I've got my main text here. It's centered, so that we keep it centered within this box. I've done a little bit of adjustment for that line. And then I'm using the sub-headline text as really a little bit more than just a line, but you could use it for like a short description. Again, something like you might do with the feature box. So you can adjust the line height, get it just right, kind of matching the line height to your site, style that up. And then we've put a little bit of a max width on here to keep that text from wrapping too far, and contain it all right in the middle there. So just a couple little ideas there to, again, get your wheels turning, kind of think of how you might use this headline element in lots of different ways throughout your website. So that is the headline element and the main differences there. And one thing to keep in mind too is with the headline element, similar to the anchor, since we have this, there's a little div that's wrapping both of these text items, and there's a div that's wrapping your graphic here. It's important to keep in mind that we have our text content margin control, and we also have our graphic margin control. So what that is that's the spacing around your text or your graphic. And that's important because if I took all of this away, you'll notice that we get, the text and the graphic lining up right alongside one another. So this is typically how you might want to start with your headline. And if you decide, hey, I want to have, my graphic to the left like it is here, then you might go into your graphic and bump the right margin out just a bit to get that spacing that you want. The reason why in this example I used 9 here and then 9 here was so I could go back to my text content flex layout and play around with reversing the layout, using a column, moving stuff back and forth. If I didn't have that equal spacing on all sides, as I moved these items around, you would see the graphic and the text kind of bump back and forth a little bit. So those margins are important for aligning things in certain ways. You can also use it, I use it sometimes depending on the text I'm using. If I want to align something just perfectly, like just so with some text, I might take this margin and unlink it and then bump it up by like a pixel or two just to get things exactly where I need them to be. So keep that in mind when you're positioning things. Those margin controls are really important to get items just so. So yeah, that's basically the headline element. So now we want to move on to our text element and discuss that. And really the text element is effectively the same, but we have this new feature called text columns. So this is really cool. It takes advantage of the CSS column layout, which is kind of a little known part of the spec. At least I don't see it used a whole lot, but it's really powerful. And I'm going to show you an example here after this one of how you might use it to create, some engaging feature lists or like a frequently asked questions section, things like that. But what's really cool about it is it's a very powerfully responsive spec without having to specify breakpoints or do a lot of funky stuff. So if I turn off text columns, you'll see that I've got just this big, box of text here, feature 1 through 8, kind of not engaging, just a big list of text. Turning this on, you'll notice that I've got 3 columns here. I've got a little bit of what's called a rule here, breaking the columns up, and a gap between each of these columns. And all of that can be adjusted in this one box right here. So there's lots going on here, and it really gives you a lot of power. So we'll run through each of these options right now. Now this content break option, I'm going to actually come back to this at the end after we hit these other options because there's kind of something unique to it. So we'll start with it just in auto. But you effectively have a maximum number of columns here. So if I bump this down to 2, notice how the box responded perfectly. I've still got my max width. I've still got this gap here. But the content is always constrained to the outer portions of the element. And whenever you add a new column to it, it's just going to slot itself perfectly within there for you to play around with your content. So we can bump that all the way up to 5. I mean, you can technically come in here and do it up to more, but you really probably wouldn't find much use out of that. Now, what's great about this maximum column setting is the idea that as you size down, it will look at how you've set up the min width option here. So what you're saying is, I want each of my columns to be at least 260 pixels wide. When it cannot be 260 pixels wide anymore, it should break, if possible, to a lower number of columns to give me that width back. So as I respond the screen down here, you'll see that right about here, we've bumped down to 2 columns. So that is right here is where those 3 columns are right at that 260 pixel width, and then just a little bit less, they're breaking to 2, and then down here it would break to 1. So notice we have a completely responsive layout without having to tell it how big the screen is when it should break. It's kind of breaking relative to itself. So if you've worked with responsive design for a while and you're familiar with breakpoints and how that works, this should be like a really exciting little concept here, because it means that you don't have to say, at 1,000 pixels wide screen, go to 2 columns. When the screen is 500 pixels wide, go to 1 column. You just say, okay, I know my content, looks best when it's at least 260 pixels wide. You specify that, and then it will size down as needed when you're working on smaller screens. So for example, we could really quickly bump this up to 4 columns, and I'll change my max width here. Probably 1, might not be enough. There we go. Okay. So again, notice we've got our 4 columns now, and it required 0 effort to get it up to 4 columns. And then as I size down, we'll break to 3, 2, and 1 like before. So very, very cool stuff you can do with that. And also notice that if you've got a max width and you set the columns to more, again, these are your maximum columns. So it'll never break your layout. It will just say, well, all I can fit is 3 columns in this layout, so I'll just stick with that. So that's kind of setting up your columns using the width there to do that. You also have your gap width. So right now I've got a gap of 40 pixels between each column. If I did that to 20 or 10, you'll see that gap getting much, much narrower. So typically you'll want that to be a little bit wider, so you've got some breathing room between each column. And then depending on if you show a rule or not, you may be able to size that gap down some. So since I've got a rule going here, I know that I want my gap to be about 20, 25 pixels. So since I have this visual break here, I'm setting it to 50 because I'm thinking of 25 pixels being on either side of this line. And you can come in here to this rule and you can adjust it to any sort. Think of it almost like a border, but used as a little divider between your columns. So we can do 4 pixels. We can change the color. So lots of stylistic stuff. And so you can use this for more than just simple columns, but you can do some really almost like print-esque layouts. Like think of magazine layouts or newspapers. It's great for stuff like that. And really amounts of content probably in this neighborhood, because if your page is super long and you do columned content for everything, people are going to have to scroll all the way down to read the first column, then scroll back up and go back down again. So it's great when you can keep longer bits of columns or text that might scroll normally kind of in one place on the screen. like this. So keep these rules in mind as well, because you can play around with those to create all sorts of little stylistic flourishes or all sorts of things here. All right, so I will move this back to, I think I had it dashed 1. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so jumping back up to the content break option. So you'll notice that with this element here, when I get down to this feature 3, what's happening is the column layout for the CSS spec will always try to equalize things out. So it always wants to have equal height columns whenever possible. So what's happening when I get to feature 3 is, since this one is really long, and because of the overall content of my container, it's deciding to wrap this feature 3 onto this next column. So for the most part, that might work great if you've just got, kind of some long form copy, just paragraphs people are reading through. That might work fine. For a situation like this, where you actually have features listed out, you might want to keep them grouped, because maybe that break, jumping from one column to the next, is just not desirable. So what you can do is you can click this content break avoid checkbox here. Now, you'll notice that when I click that, nothing happened. And when we were adding this feature in and working on it and doing a little bit of research, it seems that this is, for some reason, I don't know if it's, I don't know where in the spec this is, but browsers effectively don't re-render this property changing on the fly. So if you are working on the text element and you decide you want to see how this avoid option will look, what you'll need to do is effectively resize the browser just a little bit. So you'll see I just kind of drag my browser in and out, and now we've got this effect. So regretfully, there's nothing we can really do about that. It's kind of a browser thing. It's a unique little bug we ran across, but just keep that in mind when you're tweaking that feature. If you're going back and forth saying, well, it's not looking different, remember to bump it in. You'll see the difference. And then if you go back and you resize, you'll be able to see that. So, so now that we got that out of the way, you'll notice that when we have avoid turned on, what it's going to do is any element within this container, it's going to make sure that that element does not break in half, essentially. So whereas with auto, my feature 3 was wrapping into this next column because it was a little too long. If we turn avoid on, you'll see that feature 3 now bumps to the top of this column. Feature 4, feature 5, and all of these are never wrapping to the next column. So that works great for the most part. And this is a little bit of there's a little bit of an art to using this feature, the text columns, or just the column layout, depending on what you're using. If you want to use the break or not, and also kind of the line length of each of your features. So it really kind of comes down to playing around with all of this stuff, setting a max width, knowing how many columns you want, playing around with the min width of your columns. Doing all that, you will be able to find a way to get this laid out just right. Because for some people, this break here might not be desirable. For others, you might not mind it as much. And of course, you can tweak your copy a little bit so that this feature 3 could bump back down here. So it's really kind of an art to laying out the content within here and playing with all these settings. But the really cool thing is you get to do it in real time, as opposed to editing it in a text editor and having to refresh and see that stuff. So lots of really cool stuff there. And just to show you an example of how you might use the avoid feature in a really neat way, is I set up this little, think of it as like a little feature list, or it could be a frequently asked questions thing. I just set up a little div. It's kind of a learn about our product section. And this is one text element. And each of these boxes is a paragraph. And so what I've done is the bar here just has color in the controls. So here's the background color. This is a headline element, very simple, no graphic, no anything, just a standard headline element with some white coloring applied to it. With this element, what I've done is I've set the text color so it's white with a little bit of opacity, and then I gave it a class. So I went into customize here and I gave it a class of columnized. And then if you go into, or if I go into my CSS editor here, you'll see that with some really simple rules, what we effectively did was for each paragraph within that section, we gave it a little bottom margin of 1.5 ems. This border is what you see around here. We padded it out a little bit to give it some white space, some breathing room. And then just to make the first word that we wrapped in a strong tag stand out a little bit more, we just made it white. So if you even take this away, you can do all this look. If you don't need that strong tag to stand out, you can do that with 3 tags right there, or 3 properties. So very simple little effect. And since the margin on the bottom of the paragraphs was 1.5 ems, I set the gap width of these columns to be 1.5 ems. And what you end up with is just a really cool, really engaging little element here. And notice that I have taken a little bit of time to play with the line lengths of each item. So, my columns, they end at the exact same spot here. And again, that goes back to kind of just that art of laying it out, getting it just right, kind of playing around with what you want to say versus how you want it to look. And of course, we can make some quick adjustments to that. If we bump this up a little bit, we might see 3 columns there. Yep, so there's 3. And so again, very quickly with 2 moves, I've updated that really complex looking layout. It's almost a masonry layout if you're familiar with like Pinterest or how that works. It's effectively that idea. The only difference with the column layout is remember that it will always go from top to bottom in each column and then move to the next one. So whereas like those masonry layouts for a website like Pinterest, they actually use JavaScript to get that layout because it's not possible with pure CSS going horizontally and then laying out content. This column layout kind of approximates that look, but the layout engine is going from top to bottom in each column, and then it jumps to the next column. It goes from top to bottom there, goes to the next column, lays it out top to bottom. And that's how it makes sure to fit everything. But with 2 really quick moves, notice we went from our 2 columns to our 3 columns. If I bump this max width back in, we could shore that up. But then again, as I resize, it knows to jump to 2, and then it knows to jump to 1. And we get a really cool, totally responsive layout using just a couple of elements and some very quick CSS just to adjust things as needed. So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of a rundown on the new features here. Maybe it kickstarts some ideas that you can use for new projects. We're really excited about getting these new features in. I think they've really expanded a lot of the feature sets for these elements and kind of separated them a bit more to know what's possible. This text column feature was actually part of an old classic element called columnize. And so again, that's been kind of folded into the text element as a feature. Because really it is more of a feature of long form text rather than needing to be its own element. So thank you guys very much for watching. We are really excited about some of the new things that are coming up and really happy to get these features out into your hands now and see what you guys start creating with them. So thank you guys very much for watching, and we look forward to bringing some new videos to you all very soon.